Hey everyone, quick message before we start. This story involves real American heroes, the Navajo Code Talkers. If this moves you, hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now let's talk about a message that took 10 years to decode. My name is Dr. Leila Begay. I'm a linguist specializing in Navajo language preservation at the University of New Mexico. I'm 34 years old, and 3 months ago, I decoded a message that's made me question everything I thought I knew about World War II, about my people's history, and about what really happened on Iwo Jima in 1945. This story starts with my grandfather, Thomas Begay. He passed away in 2019 at the age of 93. He was Navajo, born on the reservation, raised with the old ways. He knew the stories, the ancient stories that most modern Navajo have forgotten or dismissed as mythology. In 2014, a man came to visit my grandfather. His name was Chester Nez. If you know anything about World War II history, that name should mean something to you. Chester Nez was one of the original 29 Navajo Code Talkers, the men who created an unbreakable code using the Navajo language, the men who helped win the war in the Pacific. Chester Nez was 93 years old at the time. He would die 3 months later. And he came to my grandfather's house in Shiprock, New Mexico, carrying something he said he'd been holding on to for 69 years. My grandfather told me about the visit before he died. Said Chester looked tired. Looked like a man who'd been carrying a terrible weight for far too long. They sat on the porch, 2 old Navajo men, speaking in their language, sharing stories the way our people have done for generations. Then Chester handed my grandfather a small cassette tape, one of those old recording tapes from the 1980s, the kind nobody uses anymore. "This is my burden," Chester said in Navajo. "I've carried it since Iwo Jima, since 1945. But I'm old now. I'm dying, and I can't take this with me to the next world. Someone needs to know the truth. But not yet. Not while I'm alive. The government, they're still watching, still listening, still making sure we keep the secret." My grandfather asked what was on the tape. Chester just shook his head. "Not for you to hear. Not for anyone of our generation. We made a promise. We swore an oath. But your granddaughter, Leila, she studies the old language. She knows the ancient words, the words we don't use anymore. She'll understand. When I'm gone, give this to her. Tell her to decode it, and then tell her to decide if the world is ready for the truth." Chester Nez died on June 4th, 2014. He was the last of the original 29 Code Talkers, the last man alive who knew the full truth about what the code was really used for, what it was really protecting. My grandfather kept the tape for 5 years, never listened to it, never told me about it, not until he was dying. Cancer. It took him slowly, gave him time to think about things, time to decide if Chester had been right. 2 days before he died, he called me to his bedside, handed me a small box. "Chester Nez left this for you. Said you'd know what to do with it. Said you'd understand the old words." He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much history. "Be careful, Leila. Sometimes the old words are old for a reason. Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves are lies meant to protect us from truths we can't handle. I thought he was being dramatic. Thought the main medication was making him confused. I took the box, promised I'd look at it, and held his hand while he passed. It took me 5 years to actually listen to the tape. 5 years of grief, of finishing my doctorate, of getting my position at the university. 5 years of that box sitting in my closet, unopened, almost forgotten. Then came 2024. The 80th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima was approaching. February 19th, 2025. The university was planning a symposium on the Code Talkers, on their contribution to the war effort. I was asked to present on the linguistic aspects of the code, on how Navajo grammar made it unbreakable. That's when I remembered the tape. Thought maybe Chester had recorded some memories, some stories about creating the code, something I could use for my presentation. I found an old cassette player on eBay, spent 2 weeks waiting for it to arrive. When it finally came, I sat in my office late one night, locked the door, and pressed play. What I heard changed everything. The voice was Chester Nez. Older than in the interviews I'd heard, weaker, but definitely him. He was speaking in Navajo, but not modern Navajo. Old Navajo. Really old. Using words I'd only seen in historical texts. Words that hadn't been in common use for over a century. And he was describing something that shouldn't have been possible. I'm going to translate what he said. As close as I can. Some of the words don't have direct English equivalents. Some of the concepts don't exist in English at all. But I'll do my best. My name is Chester Nez. I am recording this in 1982. 37 years after Iwo Jima. 37 years of keeping silent. But the dreams won't stop. The memories won't fade. And I need someone to know before I die. Someone to understand why the code worked, why it could never be broken, why it had to be Navajo. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, could hear the weight of what he was about to say. The code wasn't just about language. It wasn't just about Japanese not understanding Navajo. It was about the words themselves. The old words. The words we use to describe the Yekalashi. The words we use to describe the Anasazi's mistake. The words we use to describe why our ancestors left the old pueblos and moved to the Miotops. My blood went cold when I heard Yekalashi. That's not a word modern Navajo use. It's from our old stories, our monster stories, the ones we tell children to make them behave. Stories about things that live underground, things that came before humans, things that our ancestors fought and sealed away in deep places. But Chester was speaking about them like they were real, like they were historical fact, not mythology. On Iwo Jima, we didn't just fight Japanese. The Japanese weren't alone on that island. They found something in the caves. Something old. Something that had been there long before any humans set foot on those volcanic rocks. The Japanese tried to use them. Tried to weaponize them. It didn't work. You can't control the Yakalashi. You can only survive them or die to them. I stopped the tape, sat in my office staring at the cassette player. This was insane. Chester Nez was a hero, a respected elder, a man who'd been honored by presidents. He wouldn't make this up. He wouldn't spend his final years creating elaborate fantasies. But what he was describing was impossible. Wasn't it? I pressed play again. We called them Yakalashi because that's what they were. Underground dwellers. The old ones. The first people. But they weren't people. Not like us. They were something else. Something that evolved in darkness, in the deep places of the earth, in caves and tunnels where sunlight never reached. The Japanese found their tunnels in 1944, started exploring the cave systems under Iwo Jima, found evidence of habitation, ancient habitation, tools, bones, drawings on walls, and then they found the Yakalashi themselves, living, surviving, waiting. The Japanese scientists, they tried to study them, tried to understand them, tried to use them against us. But the Yakalashi don't take orders. They don't serve. They defend. They protect their territory. And when the Marines landed on Iwo Jima, when we started fighting for that island, we weren't just fighting Japanese soldiers. We were fighting something much older. Chester's voice got quieter, sadder. The Code Talkers, we saw things. Things the other Marines didn't see. Or if they saw, they didn't understand. Bodies torn apart in ways that guns don't tear. Soldiers who disappeared into tunnels and never came out. Sounds from deep underground. Not Japanese, not human at all. We tried to report it, tried to explain what we were encountering. But how do you explain Yakalashi to white officers who don't believe in anything they can't shoot? How do you describe underground dwellers to men who think evolution ended with humans? That's when we realized the code wasn't just for tactical communications. It was for describing the truth, for telling each other what we were really fighting. And we used the old words, the words from our stories, the words that described monsters. I had to stop the tape again, had to process what I was hearing. Chester Nez was saying that the Navajo Code, the famous unbreakable code, was unbreakable, not just because it was Navajo, but because half of it was describing things that didn't exist in any military code book, things that didn't exist in any language except Navajo, things from our mythology. Except Chester was saying the mythology was real. I looked at my watch. It was past midnight. I should have gone home, should have stopped listening, but I couldn't. I had to hear the rest. We won Iwo Jima. That's what the history books say. 36 days of fighting, 27 medals of honor, 6,800 Americans dead, 21,000 Japanese dead. We raised the flag on Mount Suribachi. We secured the airfield. We won. But we didn't eliminate the Yakalashi. We couldn't. They went deeper, back into the caves, back into the tunnels that went down further than we could follow, further than we could imagine. The last week of the battle, Command made a decision. Stop sending men into the deep tunnels. Stop trying to clear the lower cave systems. Seal them instead. Use explosives to collapse the entrances. Bury whatever was down there. Let the Yekalashi stay in their darkness. We code talkers were told to keep quiet about what we'd seen. We're told it was classified. We're told that talking about it would be treason. And we obeyed. We'd sworn an oath. We'd promised to keep the code secret. And the code included the old words. The words about monsters. So we stayed silent. The tape went quiet for a moment. Then Chester spoke again, and his voice was different, older, more tired. I'm 87 years old now. Most of the original code talkers are dead. The ones who are left, we don't talk about Iwo Jima anymore. Don't talk about what we saw in those caves. Don't talk about why the code really worked. But someone needs to know. Someone from our people. Someone who understands the old words. Someone who can decide if this truth needs to stay buried or if it needs to come to light. The Yekalashi are still there, still in the caves under Iwo Jima, still in caves under other Pacific islands, still in the deep places where humans don't go. The Japanese found them once. Others might find them again. And when that happens, when someone disturbs them again, the world needs to understand what they're facing. Not aliens, not foreign enemies, but something much older. Something that was here before us. Something that might be here after us. This is my testimony. This is my truth. This is what the Navajo Code was really protecting. Not just tactical information, but the knowledge that we're not alone, that we've never been alone, that the old stories, the old words, they weren't just stories. They were history. They were warnings. May the holy people guide whoever hears this. May they have the wisdom to know what to do with this knowledge. And may they understand that some secrets are kept not to hide the truth, but to protect the world from truths it's not ready to face. The tape clicked off. Silence filled my office. I sat there for a long time, maybe an hour, maybe more, trying to process what I'd heard, trying to decide if Chester Nez had been senile when he recorded this, trying to convince myself that this was just an old man's confused memories mixed with childhood stories. But I couldn't convince myself, because Chester had been too specific, too detailed, too consistent. And he'd used the old words correctly. Words that most modern Navajo don't even know. Words that I only knew because I'd spent years studying historical texts and interviewing the few remaining elders who remembered the old ways. He'd used the word Yekalashi exactly as it appeared in stories from the 1800s. He'd described them using terminology that matched historical accounts from Navajo oral tradition. He'd connected them to the Anasazi disappearance, to the old Pueblo abandonments, to the reasons our ancestors moved to defensive positions on mesa tops. He'd treated our mythology as history. And he'd done it in a way that suggested he had evidence, personal experience, first-hand knowledge. I needed to verify this, needed to find some way to prove or disprove what Chester had claimed. But where do you start? How do you research whether ancient underground creatures live in caves under Iwo Jima? I started with the Battle of Iwo Jima itself. Spent 3 weeks reading everything I could find. Official histories, personal memoirs, after-action reports, Japanese sources, Marine Corps archives. And I found things, little things, inconsistencies, gaps, stories that didn't quite add up. Multiple reports of Marines disappearing in tunnel systems. Official cause of death, killed by Japanese soldiers. But the bodies were never recovered. The tunnels were never fully cleared. Reports of unusual sounds from deep underground. Official explanation: Japanese tunneling operations. But the tunnels went down much deeper than the Japanese had dug. Some went down hundreds of feet, into volcanic rock that would have taken years to excavate. Reports of Marines refusing to enter certain cave systems, being court-martialed for cowardice, later pardoned with sealed records. And then I found the demolition reports, the caves and tunnels that were deliberately collapsed and sealed during the final week of the battle. Hundreds of them. Entrances filled with explosives and rubble. Official reason: securing the island from Japanese holdouts. But the locations were strange. Many of the sealed caves weren't near Japanese positions, weren't tactical priorities, were just sealed and marked as off-limits. Some of them are still marked off-limits today, 80 years later. Japanese government maintains them as memorial sites that can't be disturbed. Why? I reached out to other Navajo linguists, asked careful questions about the old words, about yakalashi, about underground dweller stories. Most of them dismissed it as mythology. Said those stories were just ways our ancestors explained things they didn't understand. Natural phenomena. Enemy tribes. Nothing real. But one elder, a woman named Betty So, who's 91 years old, she listened to my questions and got very quiet. Then she asked me where I'd heard those words. I told her about Chester Nez's tape. She nodded slowly. My grandfather fought in World War II. Pacific Theater. He was code talker too. He came back different. Quieter. Had nightmares until the day he died. He told me once, when I was very young, that he'd seen the old ones, the yakalashi. Said the war took him to places where the old things still lived. Said our people had been right to avoid those places. Said white men would learn the same lesson eventually, but only after many died. I thought he was speaking metaphorically, about the horror of war, about seeing death. But now, she looked at me with eyes that had seen a lot of history. Maybe he was being literal. Maybe they all were. That was 2 months ago. Since then, I've been trying to decide what to do with this information. Chester Nez gave this tape to my grandfather with instructions to give it to me, to let me decide if the world should know. But know what? That the Navajo Code Talkers saw monsters? That Iwo Jima was haunted by prehistoric cave dwellers? That our mythology is real? Who would believe me? And if they did believe me, what would happen? Would the military declassify other reports? Would researchers go looking for these things? Would we disturb them again? Chester said some secrets are kept to protect the world from truths it's not ready to face. Maybe he was right. Maybe this should stay buried with him and my grandfather and all the other code talkers who've passed. But something happened 3 weeks ago that changed my mind, and something that made me realize this isn't just about the past, it's about right now. 3 weeks ago, I received an email from a Marine Corps historian named Colonel Patricia Hayes. She's stationed at Camp Pendleton in California, works in the Historical Archives Division. She'd heard I was researching Code Talker communications for the symposium and wanted to share something with me. We met at a coffee shop in Albuquerque. She came in civilian clothes, didn't want to draw attention. She was in her 50s, looked like someone who'd seen combat and hadn't quite left it behind. "Dr. Begay, thank you for meeting me. I have something that I think you should see, something that's been bothering me for months." She pulled out a folder from her briefcase. "I shouldn't be showing you this. It's not classified exactly, but it's restricted. But given your research, your background, I think you'll understand why I needed to find someone who could help me make sense of it." She opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of old military reports. 1945. Iwo Jima. After-action reports from various Marine units. I've been digitizing old records for the archives. Most of it is routine stuff. Battle reports, casualty lists, equipment inventories. But I found these tucked in the back of a file cabinet. They're incident reports that were never properly filed, never made it into the official record. She spread them out on the table. I started reading. The first report was from a Lieutenant Arthur Johnson, Charlie Company, 28th Marines, dated March 15th, 1945. Near the end of the battle, while conducting clearing operations in cave system designated Tango 7, my squad encountered hostile forces of unknown origin. Subjects did not match description of Japanese soldiers. Abnormal height, approximately 7 to 8 feet. Movement patterns inconsistent with human locomotion. Squad weapons fire appeared ineffective. Lost 3 men in engagement. Recommend cave system be sealed and marked as hazardous. The report had been stamped incident unverified and filed away. The second report was from a Sergeant William Torres, Fox Company, 26th Marines, March 17th, 1945. Request immediate chaplain services for men of my platoon. Multiple soldiers reporting extreme psychological distress following operations in deep cave systems. Men describe encounters with large humanoid subjects exhibiting non-human characteristics. Several men refuse to enter any further cave systems. Recommend psychological evaluation. Stamped combat stress reaction. No further action required. There were 6 more reports, all similar, all describing encounters with something that wasn't Japanese soldiers, all dismissed or ignored. I thought they were just combat stress, Colonel Hayes said. Men in extreme situations, seeing things that weren't there. But then I found this. She pulled out one more document. This one was different. It was a communication log. Code Talker transmissions. The actual Navajo words were written out phonetically, with English translations beside them. Most of it was standard tactical communication. Enemy positions, ammunition requests, casualty reports. But one transmission, dated March 18th, 1945, was different. The Navajo words were there, but the English translation said simply, untranslatable, recommend command review. I asked a linguistics professor at USC to look at the Navajo words. He said they were real Navajo, but very old. Archaic terms he'd never seen in Code Talker transmissions. He couldn't figure out what they meant. That's when someone mentioned your name. Said you specialized in historical Navajo language. I looked at the phonetic spelling of the Navajo words. My hands started shaking. Yekalashi, I whispered. They're reporting Yekalashi. What's that? I explained. Told her about Chester Nez's tape. About the old stories. About underground dwellers in Navajo mythology. About how Chester claimed they were real and that the Code Talkers had encountered them on Iwo Jima. Colonel Hayes sat back in her chair, processing. You're telling me that the famous unbreakable Navajo Code contained words for monsters? Not monsters. That's a white word. A white concept. In Navajo tradition, they're just, other people. Different people. People who lived here before ours. People who went underground when our ancestors came. People who are still there in the deep places, if you know where to look. And you think they're real? That they're actually on Iwo Jima? I think Chester Nez believed they were real. I think he saw something that he could only describe using our old words. Whether what he saw was actually Yekalashi or something else, I don't know. But he saw something. And these reports suggest other Marines saw it too. Colonel Hayes closed the folder. There's more. Last month, there was an incident on Iwo Jima. Japanese self-defense forces conducting training exercises. A squad went into one of the old cave systems that's normally off limits. There was a collapse. 3 soldiers killed. 2 more missing. That happens. Old tunnels. Unstable rock. That's what the official report says. But I have a friend, another Marine liaison to the Japanese forces. She told me the survivors are saying something else, saying the collapse wasn't natural, saying something came out of the deeper tunnels, something that attacked them. Did anyone believe them? No, PTSD from the cave-in trauma. That's the official diagnosis. But the Japanese government has sealed that entire section of cave systems. Military exclusion zone. No one allowed in, not even for memorial services. She looked at me intently. Dr. Begay, I'm a historian. I deal in facts, documents, verifiable evidence. But I've been in combat. I've seen things that don't make it into after-action reports. Things that get explained away because acknowledging them would be too difficult, too disruptive. I think something happened on Iwo Jima, something that the Marines encountered, and the Code Talkers tried to report using the only words they had, something that's still there. And I think you were the only person who can help me understand what it was. I took the folder, told her I'd look into it, told her I'd let her know what I found. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been comparing Chester Nez's tape to these incident reports. Matching dates, matching locations, building a timeline of what really happened during those final days of the Battle of Iwo Jima. And the picture that's emerging is terrifying. The Battle of Iwo Jima officially lasted from February 19th to March 26th, 1945. But the fighting didn't stop on March 26th. Not really. Small-scale operations continued for weeks, mopping up operations, securing the island, clearing caves. According to the incident reports Colonel Hayes found, the encounters with the Yekalashi started around March 15th. That's when Marines began pushing into the deepest cave systems. The ones that the Japanese had been avoiding. The ones that went down hundreds of feet into volcanic rock. The Code Talker transmissions from that period are strange. There's a sudden increase in communications using old Navajo words. Words that don't appear in the standard code. Words that white officers couldn't translate and just marked as tactical terminology. But I can translate them now. And what they're saying is chilling. March 15th. Yekalashi, in deep tunnel, moving upward, squad retreating. March 16th. 3 brothers taken to darkness. Cannot recover. Recommend sealing. March 17th. Old ones are angry. They defend their home. We are invaders here. March 18th. Command must understand. This is not Japanese enemy. This is old war, Anasazi War. We cannot win this. March 19th. Code Talkers request permission to speak with command directly. White officers do not understand. We need to explain. March 20th. Permission denied. Continue mission. We obey. And then nothing. No more old words in the transmissions. Just standard tactical communications. Whatever the Code Talkers had wanted to tell command, they were told to keep quiet. And they obeyed. The cave sealing operations began on March 21st. Over the next week, hundreds of caves and tunnels were deliberately collapsed. Marines used explosives to fill entrances with rubble. Some caves were sealed with concrete. All of them were marked on maps with specific coordinates and warnings. Do not enter. Unstable geology. But looking at the locations, they're not random. They're all deep cave systems. All the ones that went down into the volcanic rock. All the ones where the Yekalashi had been encountered. The Marines weren't just securing the island from Japanese holdouts. They were entombing something else. Something they couldn't kill. Something they could only contain. I've spent the last 2 weeks trying to find any surviving Marines who were there during those operations. Most are dead. The Battle of Iwo Jima was 80 years ago. The youngest Marines who fought there would be 98 years old now. But I found one. Private First Class Raymond Schultz. He's 99 years old, living in a care facility in Phoenix. He was a demolitions expert with the 28th Marines. He set the charges that sealed many of those caves. I called him, explained I was researching the battle, asked if he'd talk to me about the cave clearing operations. There was a long silence on the phone. Then he said, "You talked to one of the Code Talkers, didn't you? One of them told you." "How did you know?" "Because nobody asks about the caves unless they know. Unless someone told them the truth." We were ordered never to talk about it, never to confirm it, never to acknowledge what we saw down there. "Mr. Schultz, I'm Navajo. I've heard the old stories. I know about the Yekalashi. I'm not asking you to tell me something crazy. I'm asking you to confirm something my people have always known." Another long silence. Then, "Can you come to Phoenix?" I don't want to talk about this on the phone. And I don't want to die without someone knowing the truth. I drove to Phoenix the next day, met him in his room at the care facility. He was frail, confined to a wheelchair, but his mind was sharp. When I walked in, he looked at me and said, "You look like one of them. The Code Talkers." Same eyes, same dignity. Those men saved my life more times than I can count. I owe them the truth. He told me everything. About going into the deep caves, about finding tunnels that went down further than any Japanese could have dug, about the sounds from below, about the shapes they saw in the darkness. They were tall, maybe 8 feet, maybe more. Hard to see in the dark. They didn't use lights, didn't need them. They'd been living in those caves for God knows how long. Could navigate in total darkness. They didn't attack us at first, just watched. We'd see them at the edge of our flashlight beams, standing, observing, like they were trying to figure out what we were, why we were in their home. But when we went deeper, when we pushed into the lower tunnels, that's when they defended themselves. They were fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen, and strong. I saw one of them pick up a Marine in full combat gear and throw him like he weighed nothing. We couldn't kill them. We shot them. Some went down, but most just retreated, pulled back into the deeper darkness where we couldn't follow, where our lights couldn't reach. The Code Talkers, they understood what we were dealing with. They'd been trying to tell command for days, but the officers didn't listen, didn't believe, thought it was Japanese propaganda or combat stress. Finally, a colonel who'd seen combat in the Pacific Islands before, he made the call. Stop trying to clear the deep caves. Seal them. Bury whatever's down there. Let them stay in their darkness. We'd won the surface. That was enough. So that's what we did. Set charges, collapsed tunnels, sealed entrances, buried them alive, or buried them back into their caves, at least. Trapped them down there with tons of rock between them and the surface. Raymond Schultz looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. I've had nightmares about it for 80 years. Not about killing Japanese soldiers. That was war. That was justified. But about sealing those caves. About trapping those things down there. Because they weren't enemies. Not really. They were just defending their home. And we were the invaders. The Code Talkers knew that. That's why they used their old words. Because in your language, you have words for this. Words for beings that aren't human, but aren't animals either. Words for the in-between. Words that recognize that we're not the only people on this planet. I asked him about the recent incident. The Japanese soldiers who'd gone into a sealed cave. He nodded. I heard about that. 80 years, and the seals are starting to fail. The rock is shifting. Earthquakes, erosion. Whatever we buried down there, it's not going to stay buried forever. And when those caves open up again, when those things get out, he shook his head. Someone needs to know what they're facing. Someone needs to understand that you can't kill them. You can only contain them. Only seal them away and hope the seals hold. I left Phoenix with more questions than answers. But I also left with confirmation. Chester Nez hadn't been senile, hadn't been confused. He'd been telling the truth. The Yekalashi were real, and they were still there, still sealed in caves under Iwo Jima, still waiting. But waiting for what? For the seals to fail? For someone else to disturb them? For their chance to return to the surface? I don't know. But I know this. Chester Nez gave me this tape for a reason. Gave me the responsibility to decide what to do with this information. And I've made my decision. The world needs to know. Not because I want to prove mythology is real. Not because I want attention or fame, but because those caves are starting to open. Because people are going to encounter the Yekalashi again. And when they do, they need to understand what they're facing. They need to know the old words, the old stories, the old wisdom. Because sometimes the myths are memories, and sometimes the monsters are real. After talking to Raymond Schultz, I needed to understand more about the Yekalashi themselves, not just as entities that code talkers encountered, but as part of Navajo history, part of our collective memory. Because if Chester Nez was right, if these beings were real, then our oral traditions weren't just stories. They were historical records, archives of encounters spanning thousands of years. I reached out to every traditional elder I could find. Most were reluctant to talk about the Yekalashi. In modern Navajo culture, those stories have become taboo. We tell them to children as cautionary tales, but we don't discuss them seriously. We don't treat them as history. But Betty Tso, the elder who'd told me about her grandfather, she was willing to talk. More than that, she wanted to talk. She'd been carrying stories for 91 years, stories her grandfather had told her, and she was afraid they would die with her if she didn't pass them on. We met at her home on the reservation. She made coffee, we sat on her porch, looking out at the desert, and she told me things I'd never read in any anthropology textbook. Things that aren't in the academic literature. Things that have only been passed down orally, elder to younger, for generations. The Yekalashi are old, she began. Older than Navajo. Older than any people currently living on this continent. They were here first, before us, before the ancestors of all the tribes. They were the original people of this land. But they're not human. They're human-like, close enough that our ancestors could recognize them as people. But different, adapted to different conditions, to darkness, to underground, to a world without sun. She told me the traditional story, the one her grandfather learned from his grandfather, going back generations. Long ago, longer than anyone can count, there were two kinds of people on this land, the surface people and the underground people. They evolved separately, in different environments. The surface people adapted to sunlight, to open spaces, to seasonal changes. The underground people adapted to darkness, to confined spaces, to eternal sameness. For thousands of years, they coexisted. The underground people lived in cave systems, in vast networks that stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the surface. They came out at night sometimes, to hunt, to gather, to see the stars. But mostly, they stayed below. That was their world, their territory. The surface people respected the boundaries, didn't go too deep into caves, didn't disturb the underground dwellers. There was an agreement, unspoken, but understood. The surface belongs to one people, the deep places to another. But then things changed. Population grew. Resources became scarce. The surface people needed more land, more food, more space. They began exploring caves for shelter, for water, for minerals, and they encountered the Yekalashi. At first, there were just individual encounters, Betty said. Surface people would go into a cave and never come out, or they'd come out changed, traumatized. Speaking about tall beings in the dark, about eyes that reflected light like animals, about voices that spoke in languages no one could understand. Then came the conflicts, the wars, because the underground people defended their territory, and the surface people wanted access to the caves, wanted to expand, wanted to claim everything as theirs. The Anasazi, the ancient Pueblo people, they built their cities in the canyons and on the mesa tops. They developed sophisticated societies, built great structures, created complex trade networks. But they also did something else. They explored deep caves. They tried to expand underground. And the Yekalashi pushed back. Hard. That's what the stories say. That's why the Anasazi disappeared. They didn't just leave because of drought or conflict with other tribes. They left because they'd disturbed something they shouldn't have. They'd gone into the deep places. They'd violated the ancient boundaries. The survivors, the ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples, they learned from that mistake. They sealed the caves. They marked them as forbidden. They passed down warnings. Don't go deep. Don't disturb the underground dwellers. Respect the boundaries. And for generations that worked. Different tribes had different words for them. Navajo call them Yekalashi. Hopi have another name. Zuni have another. But we all knew. We all remembered. We all respected the boundaries. Until white people came. Betty paused, sipped her coffee, looked out at the desert. White people don't believe in boundaries they didn't create. Don't respect agreements made before they arrived. They see a cave and think natural resource, think potential mine, think space to be claimed. They don't think someone else's home. So they went deep. Miners, explorers, settlers. They went into caves where they shouldn't go, and they encountered the Yekalashi. But unlike us, unlike the tribes who'd learned to coexist, white people couldn't understand what they were seeing, couldn't process it. So they called them monsters, called them devils, called them anything but what they were, people defending their territory. I asked her about Iwo Jima, about Pacific Islands. How did Yekalashi get there? She shook her head. They didn't get there. They were always there. You think cave systems only exist in America? You think underground people only evolved here? Wherever there are caves, wherever there are deep places, there are underground dwellers. Different populations, different adaptations, but the same basic pattern. People who evolved in darkness. Pacific Islands are volcanic, full of lava tubes, cave systems, tunnels that go deep into the earth. Of course, there are underground people there. Why wouldn't there be? And when Japanese soldiers started using those caves as military positions, when they built tunnels and bunkers, they encountered them, just like we did. The Code Talkers, they understood what was happening. They'd heard the stories. They knew the warnings. They recognized the signs. That's why they used the old words, because those words carry meaning that English can't express. Those words acknowledge a reality that white people refuse to see. I spent 3 days with Betty So, recording her stories, learning the details our academic texts leave out. And I realized something profound. Our oral traditions aren't mythology. They're anthropology. They're paleontology. They're history recorded in a form that doesn't require writing, passed down through generations by people who understood that some truths are too important to forget. The Yekalashi aren't monsters. They're not supernatural. They're another branch of human evolution, or human-adjacent evolution. Something that diverged from our line hundreds of thousands of years ago and adapted to a completely different environment. They're not evil. They're not demons. They're just defending their home from invaders. And we're the invaders. Always have been. Ever since we started going deep into caves, we've been violating their territory. And they've been defending it. Sometimes that defense is passive, just staying hidden. Sometimes it's active, driving intruders away. But it's always defense, not aggression. The problem is that modern humans, we don't see it that way. We see any resistance to our expansion as hostility, as an enemy to be eliminated. We can't conceive of sharing the planet with another intelligent species. We have to dominate everything. That's what happened on Iwo Jima. The Marines weren't fighting just Japanese. They were fighting for control of caves that already belonged to someone else. And when they realized they couldn't win that fight, couldn't eliminate the Yekalashi, they did the only thing they could. They sealed the caves, trapped them underground, buried them in darkness. It was a compromise. The Yekalashi got to keep their deep territory. We got the surface. And as long as the seals held, as long as no one went too deep, the peace would hold. But the seals are failing. Time and geology are opening the caves again. And humans, we keep exploring, keep going deeper, keep violating boundaries we don't even know exist. That's what happened with the Japanese soldiers 3 weeks ago. They went into a cave that had been sealed for 80 years. The seal had failed, the passage was open again, and they went inside not knowing what they'd find. They found the Yekalashi. And the Yekalashi defended their territory the same way they always have. I asked Betty what we should do, how we should handle this. Because I have Chester Nez's tape, I have the testimony of a Code Talker hero, I have evidence that something exists that science says shouldn't exist. What's my responsibility? She was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "You have a choice. You can reveal the truth and cause chaos. Cause people to go looking for the Yekalashi. Cause more conflict, more deaths, more violations of territory. Or you can keep the secret. Honor Chester's wisdom. protect both peoples by keeping them separate. But what about the next time someone encounters them? What about the next cave that opens? The next explorer who goes too deep? There will always be next times. There have been next times for thousands of years. Some people will encounter them and die. Some will encounter them and learn. This is the way it has always been. Your revealing the truth won't change that. Might make it worse. Make it. She looked at me with eyes that had seen almost a century of life. Chester Nez gave you a burden. The burden of knowledge without power. You know the truth, but you can't control what people do with it. That's the hardest kind of knowledge to carry. But here's what I think. I think Chester wanted you to document this, to record it, to make sure that when the next generation faces this choice, when the caves open again and the encounters increase, there's a record, there's testimony, there's proof. Not to prove to skeptics, they'll never believe anyway, but to help those who encounter the Yekalashi understand what they're facing, to give them context, to give them the old wisdom that might save their lives. You're a linguist. You preserve language. This is language work, too. The language of old knowledge, the language of boundaries and respect and coexistence. That's what you're preserving. She was right. That's exactly what Chester wanted. Not a public revelation, not an expose, but a record, a testimony that could be found by those who needed it, by those who would encounter the Yekalashi and need to understand. And that's why I'm sharing this now. Not because I want to convince everyone that underground people are real, but because someone, somewhere, is going to encounter them, is going to go into a deep cave and find evidence of something that shouldn't exist. And when that happens, I want them to have context. I want them to understand that they're not the first, that this has happened before, that there's wisdom accumulated over thousands of years about how to handle it. The Yekalashi are real. They're in caves across the world, in America, in Pacific Islands, in places where deep cave systems exist. They've always been there. They'll always be there. And they're not our enemies unless we make them our enemies by invading their territory. The Code Talkers knew this. That's why they used the old words. That's why Chester Nez recorded his testimony. That's why he wanted someone from his people, someone who understood the language and the history and the context to carry this forward. So I'm carrying it forward. Not with a megaphone, not with demands for government disclosure, but quietly, carefully, the way wisdom is meant to be passed down. From elder to younger, from those who know to those who need to know. If you're reading this, if you're listening to this, then maybe you're someone who needs to know. Maybe you've encountered something in a cave that didn't make sense. Maybe you've heard stories from your grandfather about the underground people. Maybe you're planning an expedition into deep cave systems and need to understand the risks. The risks aren't just geological. they're not just getting lost or trapped. They're also encountering beings that have every right to defend their territory. Beings that have been there longer than we have. Beings that deserve respect, not fear. Learn the old words. Learn the old wisdom. Learn the boundaries. Because the alternative is conflict. And in a conflict with the Yekalashi, in their territory, in the darkness they've evolved in, for hundreds of thousands of years, we will always lose. Chester Nez understood that. That's why he kept the secret for 69 years. But he also understood that secrets can't be kept forever. Eventually, the truth emerges. And when it does, it's better if there's context, if there's wisdom attached, if there's guidance on how to handle it. This is that guidance. This is Chester Nez's final message. Through my grandfather, through me to you. Respect the deep places. Respect the boundaries. Respect the underground people. And if you encounter them, remember, you're in their home. Act accordingly. 2 weeks after my conversation with Betty So, I received another email from Colonel Hayes. This one was marked urgent. Dr. Begay, we need to talk. Something happened in Okinawa. Call me immediately. I called. She answered on the first ring. Another incident. Okinawa this time. Japanese self-defense forces training exercise in the cave systems near Shuri Castle. 4 soldiers went in. 2 came out. They're in psychiatric care. Won't stop talking about tall figures in the darkness. About being attacked by something that wasn't human. Were the caves sealed after World War II? Yes, in 1945. Same protocol as Iwo Jima. But an earthquake last year damaged some of the seals. The Japanese military has been assessing the stability. That's why they were in there. And they found something. Yes, or something found them. The survivors are saying the same things Marines said in 1945. Same descriptions, same terror, same insistence that what they saw was real. I felt cold despite the New Mexico heat. It's happening more frequently. Iwo Jima 3 weeks ago. Now, Okinawa. The seals are failing. The Yekalashi are being disturbed again. Dr. Begay, I need you to help me understand something. If these things are real, if they're actually in these caves, what's the right protocol? What should we be telling people who might encounter them? I thought about Betty Tso's advice, about Chester Nez's wisdom, about thousands of years of Navajo oral tradition teaching coexistence rather than confrontation. Don't kill them. Don't try to eliminate them. Don't treat them as enemies. They're defending their territory. That's all they've ever been doing. If you encounter them, retreat. Leave their caves. Respect the boundaries. That's not military thinking. Military thinking is identify the threat, neutralize the threat. And that's why Marines died in 1945. That's why Japanese soldiers are in psychiatric care now. Because military thinking doesn't work when the other side isn't your enemy. When they're just defending their home and you're the invader. Colonel Hayes was quiet for a moment. I'm going to write a classified report. I'm going to recommend that all sealed cave systems from World War II be marked as permanent exclusion zones. No training, no exploration, no assessment. Just leave them alone. Will anyone listen? Probably not. But I'll try. And I'll reference your research. Maybe if it comes from a Navajo linguist with expertise in code talker communications. Maybe if we frame it as respecting indigenous knowledge and historical warnings. Maybe someone will pay attention. Maybe, but probably not. Because humans, we don't learn. We keep making the same mistakes. Keep going places we shouldn't go. Keep disturbing things that should be left alone. The symposium on Code Talkers was last week. I gave my presentation on the linguistic aspects of the Navajo Code. Talked about how the language's complexity made it unbreakable. How its unique grammar and syntax created built-in security. How it was the only code in modern military history that was never cracked. But I didn't mention the old words. Didn't mention Yekalashi. Didn't mention Chester Nez's tape or the incident reports or any of what I'd learned. Because that wasn't the time or place. That wasn't the audience. Instead, I honored the code talkers the way they deserve to be honored. As heroes. As men who used their language and their courage to help win a war. As warriors who served with distinction and carried burdens most of us can't imagine. After the presentation, an elderly man approached me. He was using a walker, had to be in his late 90s. He introduced himself as Joseph Kelwood, told me his father had been a code talker, had died in 2016 at age 95. My father left me something before he died, Joseph said. A tape recording. Said it was important. Said I should give it to someone who would understand. Someone who knew the old language. When I heard your presentation, heard you use some of the old words when discussing code talker terminology, I knew you were the right person. He handed me a cassette tape. Another one, like Chester Nez's tape. I haven't listened to it. He told me not to. Said it was for someone from the Navajo Nation. Someone who could decide what to do with the knowledge. I took the tape. Asked him his father's name. Thomas Kelwood. He was one of the code talkers at Iwo Jima. He came back different, quieter. Had nightmares. Refused to talk about the war, except to say that what he'd seen there changed how he understood the world. Another code talker. Another tape. Another testimony. I've listened to it since then. It's similar to Chester Nez's recording. Thomas Kelwood describes the same encounters, the same beings in the deep caves, the same frustration at not being believed, the same burden of carrying a truth that couldn't be shared. But he adds something Chester didn't mention. He talks about the Yekalashi communication attempts, about how they tried to talk to the code talkers, used sounds, gestures, what seemed like language. If they recognized that the Navajo soldiers were different from the white Marines, as if they were trying to establish some kind of understanding. They knew we were different, Thomas Kelwood says on remote. The way they looked at us, it was different from how they looked at the other soldiers. Like they recognized something. Like maybe deep in our ancestral memory and their ancestral memory, there was a connection. A remembering of the old coexistence, the old boundaries. Some of us tried to communicate back, used hand signals, used sounds, and tried to show we understood they were people, not animals, not enemies. I think some of them understood. I think that's why some of us survived. Why they let some of us retreat instead of killing all of us. But the white officers, they didn't see it, couldn't see it. For them, anything that wasn't human, in the way they understood human, had to be killed, had to be eliminated. There was no room in their worldview for other kinds of people. That's the real tragedy of Iwo Jima. Not just the thousands who died, but the lost opportunity, the chance for understanding, the possibility of coexistence. We had code talkers who could have been bridges, who could have established communication, who could have negotiated boundaries both sides could respect. Instead, we sealed them in caves, buried the problem, pretended it didn't exist. I've thought a lot about this, about what could have been, about roads not taken, about opportunities lost because of fear and misunderstanding. 3 days ago, I made a decision. I'm depositing Chester Nez's tape, Thomas Kelwood's tape, all my research notes, all the incident reports, everything I've gathered, into the Navajo Nation archives, classified, restricted access, but available to future generations of Navajo researchers who might need this information. I'm not going public, not doing media interviews, not trying to prove anything to skeptics, but I'm making sure the knowledge is preserved, making sure that when the next generation faces this challenge, when the caves open again and the encounters resume, there's a record, there's guidance, there's wisdom. I'm also working with Colonel Hayes to create a protocol, not a military protocol, a respect protocol. Guidelines for what to do if caves sealed in World War II show signs of opening. How to assess without entering too deep. How to reseal without confronting. How to coexist without conflict. Will it be adopted? Probably not by the U.S. military, but maybe by park services, by spelunking organizations, by cave rescue teams, by people who actually go into deep caves and might encounter something they don't expect. That's all I can do. Preserve the knowledge, share the wisdom, honor Chester Nez's intention without betraying his caution. If you're reading this in an archive somewhere, if you're a Navajo researcher or linguist who found these tapes and transcripts, then you're exactly who Chester Nez intended to reach. You're the next generation, the ones who'll face the choices we faced. Here's what I want you to know. The Yekalashi are real. I know that sounds impossible. I know it contradicts every scientific understanding of human evolution and biodiversity, but they're real. Thousands of years of Navajo oral tradition said they were real. The Code Talkers confirmed they were real. Multiple independent testimonies from different sources confirm they were real. They're not monsters. They're not demons. They're another branch of human or human-adjacent evolution. They adapted to deep caves, while our ancestors adapted to open plains. That's all. They're people, different people, but people. They're not aggressive unless their territory is violated. Every encounter that ended badly happened Because humans went too deep, went into spaces the Yekalashi consider home. The deaths weren't attacks. They were defense. If you encounter evidence of them, if you find sealed caves that might contain Yekalashi populations, the right response isn't military force. It's respect. Leave the caves sealed. Mark them as protected. Honor the boundaries our ancestors established thousands of years ago. You have the old words now. You have the context. You have the wisdom. Use it. Don't repeat the mistakes of 1945. Don't treat coexistence as impossible just because it's difficult. We've shared this planet with other intelligent species before. We can do it again. We just have to choose to. I know you can't read this. I know you'll never know I wrote it. But like Betty So said about prayers, sometimes you say things not because anyone will hear them, but because they need to be said. I'm sorry for what was done to you on Iwo Jima, for the invasion of your territory, for the sealing of your caves, for the violence and fear and misunderstanding. Some of our people tried to reach out. The Code Talkers. They understood. They recognized you as people. They tried to establish communication, establish respect, establish boundaries. They failed not because they didn't try, but because they weren't in charge. Because the decisions were made by others who couldn't see what they saw. I hope the seals hold. I hope your caves remain undisturbed. I hope the boundaries last. But I know human nature. I know we keep pushing, keep exploring, keep going places we shouldn't go. When the next encounter happens, when humans disturb your territory again, I hope this record helps. I hope whoever encounters you has read this, understands you're defending your home, not attacking invaders, chooses retreat over confrontation, chooses respect over domination. You were here first. This was your land before it was ours. That matters. That should matter. I hope we can coexist. The way our ancestors did for thousands of years, before we forgot, before we stopped believing in you and started believing we were alone. We're not alone. We never were. And that's okay. That's how it should be. Sharing space, respecting boundaries, living separately but peacefully. May the holy people guide us all to wisdom, to respect, to coexistence. My name is Dr. Leila Begay. I'm a Navajo linguist. I'm 34 years old. And I've spent the last 4 months decoding a message from a Code Talker hero who died 10 years ago. Chester Nez wanted someone to know, someone to understand, someone to carry the knowledge forward. I'm honored to be that person, to be the bridge between his generation and whatever comes next. The Navajo Code Talkers are American heroes. That's true. They helped win World War II. That's true. They used their language to save lives. That's true. But they also carried another burden, another secret, another truth. They encountered beings that shouldn't exist according to our modern understanding. They tried to report it, using the only words they had, and they were told to keep quiet. So they kept quiet for 69 years, until Chester Nez decided someone needed to know, until he passed that burden to my grandfather, until my grandfather passed it to me, and now I'm passing it to you. Whoever you are, whenever you are, whatever you do with this information, just remember, respect the deep places, respect the boundaries, respect the underground people. The Yekalashi are real, and they're still there, still waiting in the darkness, still defending their territory. All they've ever asked is to be left alone. Maybe it's time we honored that request.